Hey everyone. You probably felt it, huh? That little shakeup we had near Malibu this past Sunday.
Yeah, quite a little jolt.
It definitely got a lot of people talking. Well, we are doing a deep dive into all those details of that March 9th earthquake. We've got, a whole bunch of news articles and briefings here so we can really break it down what happened.
It's always interesting how even just a small tremor can really get everybody, thinking.
Totally. Okay, so let's get into the basics. It was a magnitude 4.1 earthquake, and it hit at 1:03 p.m. Pacific Time on Sunday, March 9th, 2025. The epicenter was about 7 miles southwest of Westlake Village, right there in the Santa Monica Mountains.
And that location is really key because it puts it near some pretty popular spots. You've got Matador State Beach, Leo Carrillo State Beach. And what's also really interesting is that this earthquake originated 7 miles below the surface.
Oh, wow. You know what? You've got to tell me, why does the depth even matter?
Well, you can think of it like dropping a pebble into a pond. If you drop it right below the surface, you get a big splash and a lot of ripples close by. But if you drop it from higher up, that energy disperses differently and you get smaller ripples over a much wider area.
That's a really cool way to think about it. So in this case, with a depth of 7 miles, we'd expect the shaking to be felt over a larger area, but maybe less intense in any one spot.
Exactly.
And that seems to be exactly what happened.
Right. Yeah. We have reports coming in from all over Southern California, ranging from reports of light shaking to a weaker, kind of more rolling sensation. They even felt it all the way from Goleta to Huntington Beach.
Whoa. That is a huge swath of SoCal. And the descriptions of the shaking are so interesting. Some people in Westlake Village described it as a rolling 5-second shake. Other folks in Reseda felt a steady shake, while down in Redondo Beach, it was more like a long rumble. I even saw a report from somebody in Torrance who felt 2 distinct jolts. Wild.
What's really fascinating is even with all those different descriptions, they're all categorized as light or weak shaking on what's called the Modified Mercalli Intensity Scale.
Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me. What exactly does the Mercalli scale tell us? Because, light shaking doesn't sound too alarming, does it?
Well, it's a relative. The Mercalli scale helps us understand the effects of the earthquake rather than just its magnitude. So light shaking just means you probably felt a little tremble. Maybe your dishes rattled a bit, but there's probably not going to be any damage.
Gotcha.
You see, if it were a shallower earthquake of the same magnitude, that shaking could have been much stronger right there in that epicentral area.
Makes sense. So it's not just about the raw power of the quake itself. It's about how that translates into what people actually experience on the ground.
Exactly. And speaking of those localized experiences, remember those firefighters in Malibu we were talking about before?
Yeah. Some at a station on Malibu Road didn't feel anything at all, while others at a station just down Pacific Coast Highway they did. How crazy is that?
It just goes to show how the geology and even the type of building that you're in can make a huge difference in how you experience an earthquake.
So even though we have all these people reporting that they felt it, the good news is there haven't been any reports of damage.
And that's actually pretty typical for a 4.1 magnitude earthquake at that depth. They can definitely get your attention, but they're not likely to cause any, major damage.
Okay, so we've got the details of this specific earthquake down, but here's where things get interesting. This isn't just some random isolated event. There seems to be a trend here.
You're picking up on something important. Southern California has actually seen a noticeable uptick in what we call moderate earthquakes. Those are the ones that have a magnitude of 4 or higher.
And we're not talking about like a small increase. I was reading about how seismologist Lucy Jones has been tracking this. And in 2024 alone, Southern California had 15 of those moderate earthquakes. That's the highest number in 65 years.
It definitely makes you think, is this just random, or is there something bigger going on?
Right. And I think the question on everyone's mind is, does this mean that the big one is closer?
That's the million-dollar question that everybody in Southern California wants to know, right?
It is. And I bet that's a question that scientists have been wrestling with for a while now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The quest to predict the big one has been going on for over a century. In fact, the seismic network that we have here in Southern California was first installed 100 years ago with that hope that if we track the smaller earthquakes, we'll finally figure out when that next big one is going to hit.
Wow, 100 years of data. And I'm guessing it hasn't been easy.
Yeah.
So before we jump into those historical attempts to predict earthquakes, maybe we should talk about why it's so hard to predict the big one based on these smaller quakes. It's not as simple as just connecting the dots, is it?
It's definitely not that simple. The Earth's crust, you see, it's incredibly complex. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle with all these pieces that are constantly shifting and moving. And the faults, the cracks where those earthquakes actually happen, they're more like these tangled webs in these straight lines.
Okay, so even though we've got all this data about these smaller earthquakes, we can't just assume that they're all leading up to a big one on like the San Andreas Fault.
Exactly. It's not about just assuming a pattern. I mean, it'd be kind of like trying to predict a hurricane just based on a few gusts of wind.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
There are a lot of other factors in play.
So if the smaller earthquakes don't necessarily point to the big one, what are scientists looking for? I mean, what clues are they trying to decipher?
Well, they're looking at changes in stress along the fault lines for like subtle ground deformations, variations in water levels, even for changes in gas emissions. But the problem is, even with all those tools and all those data points, the Earth doesn't always play by the rules.
It sounds like a detective story. Trying to find the right clues and put all the pieces together before it's too late.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes those clues, they can be misleading, or we just don't have all the pieces. Seismologists have spent decades and decades trying to find those reliable patterns, but it's proven really difficult.
Yeah. I was reading a quote by Susan Howe, a seismologist with the USGS, and she basically said that trying to predict earthquakes based on patterns just hasn't worked out.
And she's right. A century of monitoring has taught us so much about earthquakes. But we still can't say for sure when or where that next big one is going to hit.
Yeah, it's kind of humbling, isn't it? We like to think we can control nature, but sometimes nature just has other plans.
It's definitely a reminder that we're not always in control. But the good news is that even though we can't predict those earthquakes perfectly, we can prepare for them.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we shift our focus from prediction to preparedness, what does that look like? What are some of the things that we can do knowing that an earthquake could happen at any time?
Well, first and foremost, you got to know your risks. Are you near a fault line? What type of building do you live in? What's the soil like under your house? All those factors can really affect how much shaking you're going to experience.
So it's almost like a personal risk assessment, kind of like you would do for a flood zone or for hurricanes?
Exactly. Once you understand your vulnerabilities, you can start to put a plan together. Secure any heavy furniture that could topple over. Have an emergency kit ready with supplies like water, food, first aid, and make sure you've got communication plans set up with your family.
So like the classic earthquake preparedness checklist, right?
Yeah.
But let's be honest, sometimes it's easy to let those things slide, especially if you haven't experienced a major earthquake yourself.
Yeah, I get it. It's human nature to put things off, especially when you're dealing with potential disasters.
Yeah.
But remember, preparing for an earthquake, it's a lot like building muscle memory. You need to practice it regularly so that when that shaking starts, you know what to do without even having to think about it.
It's about making preparedness a habit, not just a one-time chore, like a fire drill, but for earthquakes.
Exactly. And it's not just about physical safety. You've got to consider the mental and emotional components of earthquake preparedness as well.
That's a good point. Earthquakes can be really scary, and the aftermath can be pretty stressful. So what can we do to prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally for something like that?
Well, I think first just acknowledge that it's okay to feel scared or anxious. It's a natural human response to a traumatic event.
Yeah, definitely.
So having a plan in place for coping with that stress, both individually and as a family, that's just as important as having your physical emergency kit ready to go.
So we're talking about like deep breathing exercises, meditation, having a good support network to talk to, maybe knowing where to find mental health resources if you need them.
Absolutely. It's all about building that resilience both for yourself and your community. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Talking to your family, your friends, your neighbors about these things can help create that culture of support and really make everybody feel more prepared.
Yeah, it's about community resilience because when an earthquake hits, we're all in this together. Okay, so we've talked about why it's so difficult to predict earthquakes, and we've covered the importance of being prepared. But now I'm really curious about those historical attempts to predict the big one. You mentioned that scientists have been trying to crack this code for over a century. What are some of the more, shall we say, interesting approaches that they've tried over the years?
Oh, there have been some fascinating ones. And some downright quirky attempts, too. You might be surprised to hear that back in the early 1900s, some scientists thought that they could actually predict earthquakes by watching animal behavior.
Wait, really? Like those stories you hear about animals acting weird right before an earthquake hits?
Exactly. There were all these anecdotal reports of, like, Dogs barking nonstop, birds flying erratically, even fish jumping out of the water in like the days or hours leading up to a quake.
That's wild. I can see why people would think there was a connection there. But did they ever actually make any accurate predictions based on that?
Sadly, no. While there might be like some small changes in animal behavior related to things like slight tilting of the ground or maybe some electromagnetic fluctuations before an earthquake happens, those changes are just way too inconsistent and difficult to interpret for us to make any reliable predictions.
So back to the drawing board for those early seismologists. What other methods did they try?
Well, another big focus was on trying to find patterns in the frequency and magnitude of earthquakes. The idea was that by tracking how often the smaller quakes were happening, we could figure out how to predict the bigger ones.
It's like they were looking for a seismic version of weather forecasting.
Exactly. And while this approach actually did give us some interesting data, it didn't really give us a reliable way to predict them. Like we were talking about before, earthquakes are super complex, and the patterns that they make can be really erratic.
So after a whole century of research, are we any closer to figuring out how to predict the big one?
It's a tough one. We've learned a huge amount about earthquakes over the past century, and our technology has gotten so much better. But honestly, predicting earthquakes with any real certainty is still a major challenge.
So it sounds like while we keep learning and keep getting better at understanding these things, the best approach for now is just to be as prepared as possible.
I completely agree. It's all about accepting that uncertainty and being responsible for our own safety and well-being.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. We learned about the Malibu earthquake. We talked about how tricky it is to predict these things. And we even went back in time to look at some of those crazy ways people tried to predict earthquakes.
And I think the big takeaway here is that even though we can't control when or where an earthquake is going to happen, we can control how ready we are for it.
That's a great point. Knowledge and being prepared, those are our best tools here in earthquake country.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So if you're listening out there and you haven't already take some time to learn about earthquake safety and put a plan together, it can make all the difference when the big one hits.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And until next time, stay curious and stay safe.